Okay, folks, this is the third lecture in the climate change theme. So we've talked about ecology and talked about, those things that determine the distribution and abundance of different organisms on Earth, different levels of ecology. Today we're going to talk more about the biosphere and what goes on there, and that's so the first question, I guess, would be to be able to distinguish between weather and climate. Okay, and what's the difference in the relationship between the two? So we see Ken Burns here is not a climate man but a weather man, because he talks about the day-to-day rainfall, temperatures, wind speed, amount of rainfall, the timing that it's coming in, so on and so forth. That is, and now a hurricane is a weather event. Okay. Climate, on the other hand, we're talking about patterns. We're talking about averages. We're talking about maximum, minimum. We're looking at time and space patterns. So when do these things happen? Where do they happen? The amount of rainfall, temperatures again. The map here shows the variation in temperature. This is not to say that temperature is hotter in Idaho than it is in South Florida, but that the day-to-day diurnal variation in temperature is higher in Idaho than in Florida. So that means basically that the nighttime lows are a lot lower than the daytime highs in places. So we see a lot more variation. So that's, again, that's not climate, that's part of climate. Okay. And so climate change then is changes in these patterns, weather patterns. Okay. For example, we see warmer winter months. So normally we'd see very low average temperatures in the winter, but those may be separate from summertime highs. So it could be that the winter temperatures increase without a concurrent increase in summertime temps. Not necessarily, but I'm just saying that this could be involved with climate change. It's a very complex phenomenon here. Again, space and time. Where do monsoon rains happen? When do they happen? What time of the year? We talked about different types of biomes and how some of these, for example, the chaparral is adapted to hot, dry summers, but warmish winters with a lot of rain. Those are things that are expected to change as the climate changes. Okay, and now, again, this is another classic thing in biology that I feel a little uncomfortable to just talk about this for 4 days and move on, because A, it's very important, B, it's very complex, C, it may appear that I'm basically skimming the top, trying to avoid getting into the complexity of this. But the reality is we just don't have the time to really do this justice and get into all the details. But suffice to say, one of the, I guess you'd say, one of the criticisms of climate change and the idea that the Earth is changing, the climate is changing here, and that could be related to humans, is just this idea that humans are small. We really are not capable of affecting climate. That climate changes on a very big scale, long time scales, and that there's been huge fluctuations in the climate, and that what we're seeing in the last 100 years is just part of this natural cycles. And I can see where that would be appealing. This is a really complex topic, and climate study is difficult. It's very complex because we have all these different time scales. You can talk about day-to-day scale. You can talk about decadal scale, centennial, millennial, longer time frames, and it will be different depending on which time frame you're looking at. Okay, and so we see that there are natural climate changes within those different spatial scales and time scales. And so the challenge for climate scientists is to separate what we are seeing as anthropogenic or man-made changes, trying to separate those from these natural cycles that we see, and then convince folks that indeed what we're seeing here recently is above and beyond that of the normal cycles. Okay, and that's so that case study, I think, does a better job of really digging into some of that evidence. All right. So this, I like this. It's a little video that, to me, really kind of illustrates this point about the complexity of climate and some of these phenomenon. Okay, you probably heard in relation to climate change about sea ice and how it's disappearing. Okay, and this sea ice, the ice that is floating in the ocean, not ice that's on land, but that is going to be partly involved with sea level rise. More the water, the ice that's on the land as it melts and runs into the ocean. But sea ice is important for a lot of different things. It's important because it changes the currents that move around the earth and through the oceans. It's important for different sea life. A lot of sea life really depends on there being sea ice. Polar bears can only hunt when there's enough sea ice. And of course it affects geopolitics too, because when that sea ice is thaws, then we can now access oil fields in the northern part of the world. So check out, this shows trends from late 1970s through till current times. We see this is Greenland here. This is Scandinavia, Siberia, and Russia. There's North America. This would be all Canada. There's Alaska. These two are very close. Okay, so the Arctic Sea is here between Europe, Asia, and North America and Greenland. Right? And I'm going to restart this, but again, the point of this in this context is, okay, this year it's higher, this year it's lower, this year it's higher, right? The amount of coverage of the sea ice. There's a lot of variability. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes back up, it goes down, right? But the key thing is if we drew a line, fitted a line, and say you did like a 10-year moving average, clearly the pattern is it goes up, but then the down is further down than before, and the up is further down than the last up. And so, again, trying to look for those patterns and separate them from the natural changes that we see in sea ice. And I think that it's clear when you look at sea ice in the last decade is much less than sea ice 40 years ago. Okay. So, but again, that it is complex, and I think that to make it simple doesn't really do this justice either. So what is it that's causing this? What is hypothesized to be driving the change? And so we can look over, 2,000 year time frame and we see that these gases and the level of these gases in our atmosphere have had natural fluctuations, but really have taken off in the last 300 years, 200 years especially. Okay, around the time that the world became industrialized, very high levels of these carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, these gases have been increasing in our atmosphere. And it's the rise in the concentrations that's really driving the increase in temperature at the Earth's surface, and therefore changes in the climate. Because again, temperature and evaporation of water and changes of pressure and the winds that it causes, right, this is the main driver in climate. So let's dig into this a little bit more. How can gases in the environment or in the atmosphere affect temperature? Now this idea that the Earth has a greenhouse effect is really not at the heart of the controversy here. Okay, anybody that would tell you that there is no greenhouse effect, that's just pure ignorance, honestly. Because, and I'll show you on the next slide, but well, let's just do that. I'll come back to this one. Damn it. I'll just show you on this one then. Yeah. We can look at different planets. We can look at their atmosphere. For Pete's sakes. I just want to look at this. Okay. We can look at the atmosphere on these different planets, and we clearly see a relationship. Planets that have very thin atmosphere, right, have very low temperature. Planets with thick atmosphere, right, have very high temperature, really. And so Earth is in this kind of Goldilocks zone where we have just enough atmosphere to trap enough temperature, enough heat energy from the sun that will allow Earth to be habitable. Okay, so let's see. Because really, think of the greenhouse, the atmosphere, as kind of like a blanket. Okay, and you see this if you, when you go to get in your car these days at the end of a cold day outside. If it's sunny but it's cold, you get in your car, it's warm in there. Why? Sunlight comes through the window, hits your seats, it changes from light energy to heat energy. The heat energy will dissipate, right? But because of the glass and your car and the insulation it provides, not all of the heat escapes. Some of it is trapped in the car, right? And this is exactly how greenhouses work. Is they're made out of glass. As the sunlight hits the glass, it changes the energy, and then from light energy, right, and then the rest of the light energy hits the concrete in the greenhouse, changes to heat energy, and some of that heat energy is trapped. Some of it does dissipate back out of the greenhouse, but some of it is trapped. Okay, and the thing that is trapping the heat in the Earth is the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is not some magical plastic bubble. The atmosphere is these gases, right? Atmospheric gases, some really important ones are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, right? They have this, it's called radiant forcing. They have the ability to trap heat. So it's like a blanket around the Earth, right? And what does the blanket do? It just traps heat and keeps it close to the surface. So it stands to reason that the thicker the blanket, the thicker the atmosphere, the more gases that are in the atmosphere, then that is going to increase the amount of heat trapped and therefore raise the temperature of the Earth. Right. Okay, and just as predicted, since the late 1800s, when again, industrialization happened. This is when steel mills, coal-powered plants, steam engines, all these things that burn fossil fuels started up in the late 1800s. And since that time, we've seen an increase in the amount of greenhouse gases, and then coincidentally, an increase in temperature. Now again, you got to be careful about saying one causes the other, but because we understand this greenhouse effect so well, and it's this kind of very logical type of a thing, it's because we understand this, then the connection is clear here between raising temperatures and rising greenhouse gases. Okay, is temperature increase even around the world? Absolutely not. Right? Again, this speaks of the complexity of the Earth. It speaks to the complexity of jet stream. So imagine there's these huge rivers of wind moving around high in the atmosphere, and it's like a conveyor belt. It may pick up heat here and then carry it to another spot. There is the jet stream that carries heat energy from the ocean up north and then down along places like Ireland and England, right? Southern Ireland is pretty warm relative to how high it is in latitude, right? And that's again because of this, the movement of wind around the Earth. So regardless, we see that some places are actually getting colder in the Antarctic. Some places are getting a little bit warmer, but then other places are getting warmer very rapidly, and that is largely in the Arctic area. Okay, so it's not an even warming. Okay, why is this? We talked about the carbon cycle last time, about atmospheric carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, organic carbon in the form of soil, carbon in the ocean, and that can be locked up in different chemicals but can end up making carbonic acid. And so there's these different pools of carbon in the Earth's biosphere, and the carbon gets shuffled from one pool to the next, right? From the atmosphere into living things. That's photosynthesis, right? We're taking carbon dioxide, building it into glucose. If those photosynthetic organisms get buried and compressed and heated and pressurized for millions of years, they can turn into coal, they can turn into oil, right? Respiration. There's these sheep chewing up some photosynthetic grass and then burning, oxidizing that glucose, putting off CO2. So respiration largely creates atmospheric carbon dioxide. Photosynthetic processes actually lock that carbon from the atmosphere into another form where it's not adding to climate change, right? But the big one, the new arrow here, is the combustion of fossil fuels. So again, here's our oil derricks pumping up oil, fracking up natural gas, whatever it is, and then using that to power our factories, our cars, so on and so forth. So this is a very new, it's new since 1880, right? And it's totally coincidental with this graph, okay? Or with this graph. So what was that oil and propane and all that stuff doing before this time? Was just sitting in the earth, locked up, Here we're digging it out of the earth, we're burning it, and when you burn those things, carbon goes back into the atmosphere. Oh, shoot, there it is. So again, it's not as extreme as turning Earth into Venus, but it is adding a lot more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which then increases the temperatures. Okay, again, it's happened before, right? Earth goes through these cycles of cold and warm and so on and so forth. These are different trees and their changes in distribution in prehistoric times. So we see going back to 21,000 years ago. And this is one species on top, 2, 3, and 4 species. And so we see if we went back 21,000 years ago, this species lived in southern, eastern North America. Right? Why? Because this all was a huge sheet of ice. This is a glaciation. Okay, as the glaciers receded to the north, right, what do we see? Those species then spreads north. Right? But actually splits into a northern population and a southern population. That we see a lot too. And that's generally the pattern here, is that these ice sheets push species down to the southeast. As they recede, the species spread back to the northeast. Okay, so that has happened in the past, but the thing is, you know, when this spread was happening between, 3,000 and 18,000 years ago, there weren't roads and cities and all these human disturbances that impede the movement of plants and animals across the landscape. So that's one of the big worries is, sure, as the earth warms, species can move north, right? But part of the issue is, it's, an animal that's a small animal like a salamander is not going to be able to cross all the roads between here and West Virginia that they would need to move in order to find cool, moist conditions as the earth warms. Okay, we're seeing this, and this is in historic times, since the 70s. Here's 3 different species of aquatic marine life. They probably live on that continental shelf, right? Not in the abyssal zone or not in that intertidal, but on that continental shelf. And we know a lot about these organisms because they are important economically. So we have catch records from where they've been captured in the ocean. And we see clearly that between the 70s and the mid-2015, that in all 3 of these species, the distribution has shifted to the north and the east here. Yeah, just relatively easy for an aquatic organism because there aren't roads and things in between, right? But so this has taken some adjustment on the part of fisher people and on the part of regulators trying to determine when and where to have seasons. So this is not hypothetical things that may happen in the future. These are things that are happening and have happened. Another species, this is an important pollinator here. And we see, again, the story here being the dark blue range and the pink colored range. So the blue colored range is old times, right? From basically the birth of our country until 1960s, and then so that was a total of 200 years. And then in the last 50 years, we've seen changes in the distribution. So what's generally the trend here is from being distributed in these low areas all the way down to the coast in Virginia, over into the Midwestern states, the range has contracted and has centered more on the Appalachian Mountains, which is about finding cooler areas because of the high elevation. So a warming Earth will affect the ecology of these organisms. It's going to affect their distribution spatially. Where are the organisms found on Earth? There's another really kind of troubling thing that a warming Earth is going to affect, and these are called mutualistic relationships. Think about mutualism as when two organisms are basically found together all the time. When you find these corals, there's always a little algae called a zooxanthellae that is found with them. Right? This is a mutualistic relationship. Both benefit from the relationship. The coral gets a place to, the algae gets a place to live, and maybe more than that. And the coral, by having a photosynthetic algae in its body, gets some leftover extra carbohydrates. Okay, so this is beneficial. And again, we talked about the distribution of coral reefs on the Earth and how important that they are for a variety of sea life, and that these animals live in very clear water because those photosynthetic algae require sunlight, right? So here's a healthy coral. You got the two friends living together, right? But when the temperature rises in the water or becomes polluted, then these little photosynthetic algae leave the body of the coral, okay, leaving the coral with a lot less food, and eventually, right, so when the algae leave, the coral appears to be bleached out. So again, the thing that gives the coral the color is actually that photosynthetic algae. When it leaves, it becomes bleached, and it's vulnerable. It's not dead. It looks like it's dead, but it's not dead. The issue is it's more susceptible to disease and loses a lot of its food. So if the water temperatures come back down, they have seen that the mutualistic relationship can be reformed and the coral can rebound. But if temperatures stay up for too long and this relationship is not reformed, then the coral can die. And that's a bad thing. Okay. I've seen this all around the world, from Central America to Australia, the South Pacific. Okay, so big issue again, because these structures, these coral reefs, are home to just thousands of species of fish, arthropods, and mollusks. And so as they die, a lot of other organisms lose their habitats too. Okay, more about mutualistic relationships. And this goes back to our discussion of pollinators, right? It takes two to tango. In order for us to have our food plants, anything that's a fruit or nut, anything that is a result of sexual reproduction in plants, we need to have pollinators, okay? And this is a very finely tuned relationship. We did talk about that in the pollinator theme, and about coevolution, about the shape of the flower and how that attracts different types of pollinators, and about the scents that are produced in order to attract pollinators, right? So, yeah, very finely tuned relationship. And what is being observed is that the timing of which plants flower and the time at which the pollinator is there to gather the pollen can change. Okay, so how does this work? So there's a couple different things that tell plants and animals when to be active, when to flower, this timing of phenology, it's called. One of the things that can tell, for example, right now, white-tailed deer are starting to breed, and that is largely determined by photoperiod. That's the balance of light and dark in a given day. So we're getting into these longer nights and shorter days right now. That's called photoperiod. But alternatively, the timing of events could take place because of temperature. And so, for example, soil temperatures start to get down because of cold nights, and that can tell plants to flower. It can tell plants to lose their leaves. A lot of different timing events can be timed based on temperature. Again, other events can be timed based on photoperiod. So as we add more atmospheric gases and we bring temperatures up, that can change things like plant flowering time. If you are an organism that's cued into photoperiod, that's not affected by the climate change. Right? Photoperiod is not affected by increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So one could change and the other doesn't change, and so what you can end up with, one, in some cases, no change at all happens. Other times things become later. As long as the pollinator and the pollinated change approximately the same, then everything is fine. But what is being observed is, for example, timing of flowering is moving earlier because spring temperatures are increasing. And so the flower is there, it's open, and it can be missed by its pollinator that is specially tuned to pollinating that species. Again, why? Because the fly or the butterfly or the bee is waiting for the temperature. It's not actually waiting for the temperature, that it's waiting for the photoperiod to change. It's waiting for a specific balance of light and dark in a given day. Okay, and what's the big deal with this mismatch in pollinators? This diagram does a really good job of showing or explaining what are the big deals here. So again, we've got the plant on the left, the animal on the right. They're really finely tuned. Again, some species of flowers are only pollinated by a given type of bee, or like, for example, there's a type of bumblebee that is specialized on pollinating blueberries. And so they need to have the same phenology or timing, and they need to be distributed in the same place. So spatially and temporally, these organisms need to be matched up. Okay, so climate change, we've talked about how it can affect the distribution of animals and plants. Animals might move up the hill, up in elevation, to keep in the same temperature range, or they may move to the north, or it could be both, right? Phenology, we've seen how things like soil temperature or nighttime average temperature might change the time at which a flower blooms. And so you can get a time mismatch, or you can get a spatial mismatch, where the animal and plant are not together at the right time in order to achieve pollination. And when pollination is affected, then for the bee, this can cause problems because they're not getting enough pollen, right? There's not enough food availability, which then affects the ability to produce eggs and for the eggs to hatch and survive, and that can lead to changes in population dynamics. So that can lead to decline in the population of that given pollinator. On the other hand, because the number of visits by the pollinator goes down, that affects how much pollen is deposited at the flower, which is then going to affect how much sexual reproduction happens, right? Because we think of sex as being an all or nothing type thing, but in plants, you can have a little bit of pollen brought to the table and maybe 1/10 of the seeds produced, 1/10 of the amount of fruit containing that seed being produced. So it's not an all or nothing with plants, and so you can drive population dynamics again by changing the amount of pollen brought. So these things are really actually very big deals, and we're seeing these effects on both sides in terms of the population dynamics of the pollinated and of the pollinators. So starting to bring together the biosphere, ecological factors determining timing and spatial patterns of plants and animals, and then how and why adding these different gases to the atmosphere can lead to increases in temperature, and then alternatively how that can affect or drive the climate, and how climate can affect these mutualistic relationships. So it is, we're seeing big deals happening already. We're seeing declines in a lot of pollinators, but not just pollinators. We're seeing a decline in many other insects. We're seeing declines in a lot of sea life, and these things are quite easily linked to the change in climate. So, keep your mind open. Keep reading about these things, and I hope that you'll have a little bit better foundation to be able to understand some of the stories that you read about this.